Lucia DeLuca's cane tapped softly against the marble floor as her son led her to their table at Rossi's, the golden chandeliers casting long shadows across his face. She moved with the grace of someone who didn't need sight to navigate the world, her other senses sharper than most people's eyes ever would be. But it was Alessandro who noticed everything. At 32, he'd built an empire in Chicago's darker corners. He noticed the tremor in a man's voice during negotiations, the half-second hesitation before a handshake, the way people's pupils dilated when they were afraid. His mother called it a curse. He called it survival. So when Emma Blake approached their table, he noticed immediately. It wasn't just the bruise, though that was impossible to miss. The left side of her face bore the faint purple evidence of blunt force trauma, carefully hidden beneath makeup that didn't quite reach the jawline. Foundation couldn't smooth over the swelling or the way she favored her right side as she moved. What he noticed more was how she tried not to be noticed. "Good evening, Mr. DeLuca, Mrs. DeLuca," Emma said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. In the 3 months she'd worked at Rossi's, Alessandro had never heard her raise her voice above normal conversation level. She kept her head down, moved like she was trying to take up less space, like she was hoping the world would forget she existed. "Someone new," his mother said gently, her blind eyes somehow tracking Emma's presence more accurately than his could. "Not new, actually," Emma replied with a practiced smile. "But thank you, Mrs. DeLuca." Lucia tilted her head slightly. "No, I mean your energy. It's different tonight." Alessandro leaned back in his chair, studying Emma. She was young, 26 according to her employment file, petite with dark hair tied neatly back and eyes that rarely met his. Professional, quiet, the kind of person who made themselves invisible. But invisibility doesn't come with bruises. As Emma leaned forward to place his plate before him, the chandelier light caught her cheekbone. The angle was perfect, or perhaps perfectly terrible. The bruise was no accident, no simple fall. The shape, the distribution, the way it wrapped from cheekbone to jaw. Someone had struck her recently, and they'd done it more than once. His jaw tightened. "Who did this?" he asked quietly, his voice the kind of low that made people listen whether or not they wanted to. Emma froze mid-motion. "Excuse me, Mr. DeLuca?" "The bruise," he said evenly. His dark eyes locked on her face. "Who touched you?" The restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Nearby conversations dimmed. Emma's grip tightened on her serving tray until her knuckles went white. "It's nothing," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. "I tripped at home. I'm very clumsy." His mother reached out, finding his arm with perfect precision. A warning. But Alessandro didn't look away. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. There was something in his stillness that was more dangerous than anger. The calm of a man who had already decided what would happen next. "Nothing doesn't leave marks like that," he said softly. "Nothing doesn't make someone's hands shake when a stranger asks about it." Emma's face went pale. "Really, Mr. DeLuca? I'm fine. You can go," he said, releasing her from his gaze. His tone was final, a door closing. "Tell Marco we need more water." Emma nodded quickly, relief and fear mingling across her face as she fled toward the kitchen. Lucia's fingers tightened slightly on his arm. "Alessandro." "I know, Mother," he said quietly, watching Emma disappear into the back. "Do you?" Lucia turned her head toward her son, her blind eyes somehow seeing everything. "Not every bruise is yours to heal. Not every wound is yours to fix. This one is," he said simply. His mother was silent for a long moment. Then, "When you were a boy, I taught you that our family protects those beneath our roof. I didn't know you would one day protect those outside it too. That your mercy would be more dangerous than your anger." Alessandro picked up his fork, but his mind was no longer on dinner. It was on the terrified waitress in the kitchen, on the bruises that told a story she was too afraid to speak aloud, and on the cold certainty settling in his chest. Someone had made a mistake. They'd hurt someone who had just entered Alessandro DeLuca's sphere of awareness, and that was a line he didn't allow people to cross. Outside, Chicago's evening traffic hummed past the restaurant. Inside, in the polished dining room of Rossi's, Alessandro De Luca sat with his blind mother and made a silent promise. By the time the restaurant closed that night, Emma Blake didn't know it yet. But her life had just changed. Because Alessandro had seen her bruises. And Alessandro Duca always made sure mistakes were corrected. Hours later, as the last patrons left and chairs were stacked onto tables, Alessandro sat in the restaurant's back office while Marco, his head of security, placed a folder on the desk before him. "That was fast," Alessandro said, gesturing him to sit. "It wasn't hard," Marco replied grimly. "You're not going to like it." Alessandro opened the folder. Inside was a photograph of a man in a Chicago Police Department uniform, broad-shouldered with sharp features and eyes that were smiling without warmth. Officer Carl Benson, Narcotics Division, decorated, connected, and according to the domestic disturbance reports Marco had pulled, he was also Emma Blake's ex-boyfriend. "How long?" Alessandro asked quietly. 3 years married. Divorced 18 months ago. She filed for a restraining order that expired 2 weeks back. And she didn't renew it? She tried. Benson showed up with a lawyer. Judge denied the extension. Marco's jaw tightened. Said there wasn't enough evidence of ongoing harassment. Alessandro's fingers drummed against the desk. "But the bruises are fresh." "Very." The office fell silent. Outside, the kitchen staff finished their closing routines. Soon, only Emma would remain. Cleaning, organizing, moving through the restaurant like a ghost. Moving through his restaurant like a ghost who was no longer safe. In the dining room, Emma moved mechanically between tables, stacking chairs, wiping down surfaces. Her mind was already half gone, planning her escape. She had $3,000 saved. Enough for a deposit somewhere far from Chicago. Somewhere Carl couldn't find her. She'd thought the restraining order would be enough. She'd thought the divorce papers meant freedom. She'd been naive. The bruise on her face throbbed with each memory. His hand around her jaw in the parking lot last week. His voice low and dangerous. "You think you can just leave me? You think anyone will believe you over a cop?" She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and kept working. By midnight, the restaurant was empty. Only the soft hum of the refrigerators in the kitchen and the distant sound of traffic filtered through the walls. Emma grabbed her jacket and headed toward the back exit, toward the alley where she'd parked her old sedan 3 blocks away. That's when she heard it. An engine idling in the alley. The distinctive rumble of a police interceptor. Emma froze mid-step, her hand on the back door. Through the narrow window, she could make out the silhouette of a black sedan. Her heart seized. She knew that car. She knew the sound of its engine, the way it idled with that particular growl. Before she could move, the door swung open. "Thought you could ignore my calls?" Carl's voice filled the alley like poison. He stepped inside, his uniform still crisp from his shift, his smile sharp enough to cut. "You've been avoiding me, baby. That's not nice. You need to leave," Emma whispered, her voice barely steady. He laughed. That charming laugh she'd once loved, now twisted into something cruel. "Leave? We're just getting started." He grabbed her face, his thumb pressing directly against the bruise on her cheekbone. Pain exploded across her vision. "You like working here? Nice restaurant. Nice tips, I bet." "Carl, please. Please." He twisted her face slightly, studying the bruise like it was a work of art. "Is this what you told them? That you fell? That you're clumsy?" His other hand found her arm, squeezing hard enough to make her gasp. "You think anyone here can protect you? I'm a cop, Emma. The law works for me. Nobody in this city touches me. Let her go." The voice came from the shadows of the alley, deep, controlled, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. A man stepped from the darkness into the dim light spilling from the restaurant door. Tall, composed, moving with the deliberate grace of someone who'd never needed to rush toward violence because violence simply obeyed him. Alessandro De Luca. Carl's hand tightened on Emma's arm for a moment, then released her. He turned slowly, sizing up the newcomer with the casual arrogance of a man who'd spent years hiding behind a badge. "This isn't your concern," Carl said evenly. She's my ex-wife. Personal business. She works here. Alessandro's voice was quiet, almost conversational. That makes it my concern. You think you scare me? Carl laughed, a sound like breaking glass. I'm a cop. What are you going to do, Duca? Everyone knows who you are. Everyone knows what you are. You touch me, and I'll have every unit in the city hunting you. Alessandro took a step closer. The alley seemed to contract around them. The badge won't help you when the city stops believing in it, he said simply. And they will. Silence stretched between them. Taut, dangerous, the kind of silence that precedes something irreversible. Carl's hand moved toward his belt, fingers hovering over his weapon. But something in Alessandro's stillness made him reconsider. This wasn't a man who fought with guns. This was a man who fought with certainty. After a long moment, Carl stepped back. He pointed a finger at Emma, then at Alessandro. You'll regret this. He turned and walked back toward his sedan. The engine roared to life. Tires screeched against asphalt. Within seconds, the alley was empty except for the fading echo of his departure. Emma stood frozen, trembling violently, unable to process what had just happened. He's a cop, she whispered. You can't fight him. No one can. Alessandro turned to look at her. Really look at her, and his expression was calm in a way that terrified her more than Carl's anger ever could. Then the city will, he said quietly. He glanced toward the street where Benson's taillights had vanished into the night, and in that moment, Emma understood something fundamental. She had just watched a man make a decision that would reshape both their fates. Outside, Chicago's midnight streets hummed with indifferent life. But in that alley, the world had tilted on its axis. And neither of them would ever walk quite the same way again. The penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a building on Michigan Avenue, all floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist elegance, the kind of space that whispered money without screaming it. By day, it was a showcase of modern architecture. By night, with the city sprawling below in a maze of lights, it became something else entirely. Command center, a war room disguised as a home. Alessandro sat at the kitchen island at 5:47 a.m., before the city fully woke, and made the call that would set everything in motion. Matteo, he said quietly. My office. Now. 20 minutes later, Matteo Romano, Alessandro's right hand since childhood, now his head of operations, sat across from him with coffee and an expression that suggested he'd learned long ago not to ask unnecessary questions. Carl Benson, Alessandro said, sliding a photograph across the table. Chicago Police Department, Narcotics Division. I need everything. Bank records, case files, complaints filed against him, any connection between his name and women who've gone quiet. Anything that suggests he uses his badge as a weapon. Matteo studied the photo for a moment, then looked up at his oldest friend. What did he do? He hurt someone. Someone under my protection now. Matteo nodded slowly, understanding without needing details. This is going to take time. Then work fast. Breakfast was at 7, a routine that had survived decades. Lucia DeLuca seated at the head of the table in the dining room overlooking the lake, her blind eyes seeming to see everything anyway. Alessandro joined her with his usual coffee, black, no sugar. She knew something was wrong before he'd taken his first sip. You've started something again, she said quietly, her tone carrying the weight of experience and concern. She didn't look at him. She rarely needed to, but her attention was absolute. I can hear it in the way you move, that particular stillness that comes before a storm. Alessandro set down his cup. A man with a badge shouldn't leave bruises on a woman's face. Lucia was silent for a long moment. Then, and this woman, she asked for your help. She didn't need to. His mother's lips pressed into a thin line. She reached for her glass of water, finding it with practiced ease, and took a deliberate sip. When she spoke again, her voice was measured, careful. The voice of someone choosing words like moves on a chessboard. Your father started wars for less noble reasons, she said finally. And he paid the price for every single one. I'm not telling you to do nothing, Alessandro. I'm telling you to be certain about what you're willing to become in the process. He didn't respond. They both knew he already was certain. By noon, Matteo had preliminary findings. The investigation unfolded like a corruption diagram. Lines connecting to other lines, each one revealing a darker pattern. Multiple complaints filed against Benson by women over the past 5 years, all mysteriously lost or misplaced by internal affairs. A custody case that vanished from court records entirely. 3 separate domestic disturbance calls that were never officially logged. And the money, that was the real story. He's been paid, Matteo said, spreading documents across Alessandro's office desk. Regular transfers into offshore accounts, never more than 15,000 at a time, just below the reporting threshold. Narcotic seizures that are significantly lighter than what officers report confiscating. He's either skimming or receiving payment for looking the other way. Alessandro studied the banking records, connected to his uncle, the deputy chief, but more than that, to the Castellano family. They've got distribution networks all through the north side, and Benson's been protecting their routes for at least 2 years. The pieces crystallized. A corrupt cop protecting dealers, taking payments, using his badge to silence the women he damaged. The system protecting itself from the inside, one bruise at a time. What about the women? Alessandro asked. Scattered. Some left the city. One moved to her parents' house in Milwaukee. Another stopped returning calls to the friend who reported her missing. The friend gave up after a year. Matteo paused. Emma Blake tried to report him. Got a restraining order that expired 2 weeks ago. He had it denied on renewal. Alessandro's jaw tightened. Meanwhile, across the city in a cramped apartment in Pilsen, Emma sat on her sister's worn couch with a cup of untouched tea growing cold in her hands. She'd found the note under her door that morning. You'll never escape me. Her sister Rosa, 3 years younger and infinitely more practical, was pacing. We call the police. We get another restraining order. Rosa, he is the police. Emma's voice was hollow. Did you miss that part? Rosa sat down beside her. Then we leave. Tonight. We pack and we drive and we don't stop until we're somewhere he can't find us. Emma wanted to believe it was that simple. She wanted to believe that distance could matter, that another state line would finally buy her safety. But she'd already tried that once. She hugged her sister and lied. I'm fine. Really. I'm just tired. In his penthouse office, Alessandro watched the sun sink toward the lake while Matteo worked through the night, his team expanding the investigation with surgical precision. Bank transfers were traced. Phone records were obtained. Narcotics cases were examined for inconsistencies. A map of corruption was being drawn in real time. He hides behind the system, Alessandro said quietly, more to himself than to Matteo. Uses it like a shield. Uses it like a weapon. So we dismantle it, Matteo replied, not looking up from his laptop. We make the system turn on him instead. By 3 a.m. they had enough. Not enough for a prosecution, not yet, but enough to start a fire that would spread on its own. Matteo prepared the package. Photos, records, bank statements, transcripts of case files that didn't match seizure reports. Evidence of a man who'd weaponized his badge. An anonymous envelope, ready to travel. At dawn, a journalist named Sarah Chun found the manila envelope on her doorstep at the Chicago Tribune. No return address. No note. Just photographs of a man in a CPD uniform and documents that suggested the system was far more broken than she'd ever suspected. She began reading, and within minutes, she was making phone calls. In his penthouse, Alessandro stood at the window overlooking the city as it woke to a new day, and somewhere in that sprawling landscape, wheels were beginning to turn that he'd set in motion. The city would do the rest. He only had to be patient. Lucia DeLuca arrived at Rossi's on a Thursday afternoon when the restaurant was nearly empty. That quiet pocket between lunch service and dinner prep when the marble floors echoed with absence and the chandeliers cast their light on vacant tables. She didn't come often, preferring her son's penthouse or her own home. But on this particular day, she had somewhere specific to be. Emma was refilling water glasses in the back section when she heard the soft tap of a cane against marble. She turned to find Lucia standing near the entrance, elegant in a cream-colored coat, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her blind eyes seemed to search the room with an awareness that had nothing to do with sight. "Mrs. DeLuca," Emma said, moving toward her quickly. "Let me help you to a table." Lucia smiled gently. "I'm looking for you, actually. Will you join me for tea?" It wasn't a question, though it was asked like one. Emma hesitated for only a moment before nodding, then remembering, with a small jolt of embarrassment, that Lucia couldn't see the gesture. "Of course," Emma said softly. "Of course, I'd be happy to." They sat at a corner table, away from the light and the lingering staff. Lucia ordered chamomile, and Emma brought the pot herself, settling into the chair across from the older woman with a nervousness she couldn't quite contain. "You're frightened," Lucia said immediately, not unkindly. It was simply an observation, stated as fact. "I can hear it in the way you breathe." Emma's hands found her lap. "I'm fine, Mrs. DeLuca." "Really? You sound like someone who's been told to stay quiet for too long," Lucia interrupted gently, pouring her own tea with practiced precision. "Someone who's learned that speaking up brings consequences." The words landed with unexpected accuracy. Emma's throat tightened. Lucia took a sip of her tea, then turned her head toward Emma's general direction, her blind eyes somehow still making perfect contact. "Tell me about the bruise, Emma. The real story, not the one about clumsiness or accidents." Emma opened her mouth to deflect, then closed it. Something about Lucia's presence, the absolute calm, the absence of judgment, made lying feel impossible. "There's a man," Emma said quietly. "Someone I used to be married to. A police officer. He doesn't accept that we're divorced." Lucia nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she already suspected. "And he hurt you?" "Yes. More than once." "Yes." Lucia set down her cup with deliberate care. "I've lived 72 years, Emma. I've lived through war, through heartbreak, through raising a son in a world that rewarded cruelty. And in all that time, I've learned one thing with absolute certainty. Sometimes the people sworn to protect are the ones who wound deepest. They have the tools, you see, the authority, the knowledge of how the system works, and they use all of it as leverage." Emma felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. No one had ever said it out loud like that. No one had ever named it so plainly. "I'm trying to leave," Emma whispered. "Leave Chicago. Start over somewhere he can't find me." Lucia reached across the table, and though she couldn't see Emma's hand, she found it with the certainty of someone who'd navigated the world without sight for decades. Her grip was warm, firm, real. "Running is survival," Lucia said. "But it's not living. There's a difference." They sat in silence for a long moment, hands connected across the table. Two women separated by decades, but united by an understanding that needed no words. From the kitchen doorway, Alessandro watched them. He'd been observing since his mother arrived. Had known, somehow, that she'd come for a reason beyond afternoon tea. He watched Lucia speak, watched Emma's walls crumble piece by piece, watched his mother's hand find hers with that uncanny precision, and he felt something twist inside his chest. Admiration for his mother's wisdom, guilt for what he'd already set in motion. The two emotions warred with each other, leaving him standing motionless in the shadows. That evening, in the penthouse, Lucia waited until Alessandro joined her for dinner. They ate in near silence, his mother's way of creating space for important conversations. Finally, she spoke. "Don't turn her pain into your weapon," Lucia said quietly, her fork pausing above her plate. Alessandro knew exactly who she meant. "It's not a weapon, Mother. It's justice." "Justice." Lucia set down her fork with deliberate precision. "A word men use to justify many things. But justice doesn't always need to shout, Alessandro. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it simply holds someone's hand while they find their own strength." "She's afraid," he said. "She's been beaten down by someone who was supposed to protect her. The system failed her. The badge protected him instead." "I know," Lucia said. "I sat with her this afternoon. I heard the fear in her voice. I felt it in her hands. She turned her blind eyes toward her son. But there's a difference between protecting someone and saving them. One is an act of presence. The other is an act of control. Alessandro's jaw tightened. I'm not trying to control her. Aren't you? Lucia reached for her water glass. By moving against Benson without her consent, without her even knowing what you've done, you're making a choice for her. You're deciding what she needs. That's control, my son. No matter how noble the intention. He wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Because some part of him knew she was right. The next morning, Alessandro sat in his study with his coffee when Marco entered with a newspaper. The headline read, "Corruption in Chicago PD? Anonymous whistleblower leaks files. Internal Affairs opens investigation into Detective Carl Benson." The wheels had been set in motion. The city was beginning to turn. But as Alessandro read the article, he couldn't shake the memory of his mother's words. Couldn't forget the expression on Emma's face when she'd admitted her fear. He'd chosen to be her savior. Now he would have to live with the consequences of that choice. Marco began trailing Carl Benson on a Tuesday, positioning operatives at key points across the city. The 14th Precinct, the bar where Benson drank most evenings, the apartment building in Pilsen where Emma's sister lived. Not to hurt him, not yet, just to watch, to document, to ensure that when the investigation accelerated, they had a complete picture of his movements, his contacts, his patterns. The surveillance was surgical, discreet, professional. Emma noticed the unfamiliar car 2 days later. A silver sedan, parked across from her apartment. Different angles, different times, but always there, always watching. She saw the same face at the coffee shop near her work. A woman with dark hair scrolling through her phone at a nearby table, eyes occasionally lifting toward Emma's direction. Her nervous system, already frayed, went into overdrive. She didn't confront Alessandro until Friday, when she found him sitting alone in Rossi's back office after her shift. Her hands were shaking as she closed the door behind her. "Are you spying on me?" she demanded, her voice low but fierce. Alessandro looked up from his desk, expression unreadable. "I'm protecting you. I didn't ask for your protection." Emma's voice cracked with anger. "I didn't ask you to put people in my life, to follow me, to invade my privacy. I have been controlled by someone my entire adult life, Alessandro. Every decision monitored, every movement tracked, and I finally got away from that. I finally had autonomy. And now you're—" She stopped, her throat tightening. "You're doing the exact same thing." "It's not the same," he said coldly, not rising from his chair. "I'm not going to hurt you. Aren't you?" Emma's laugh was broken. "You're telling me what I need without asking. You're making decisions about my safety without my consent. That's control, Alessandro. That's exactly what he did. That's exactly why I'm terrified all the time. Because I learned that care and control look identical when you're on the receiving end of either one." The words hung in the air between them. Alessandro had prepared for many things. Anger, gratitude, fear. He hadn't prepared for the specific way Emma's accusation would cut through his carefully constructed justifications. He stood slowly. "Then tell me," he said, his voice softer now, the hardness stripped away. "Tell me what you need, and I'll listen." Emma felt something break open inside her chest. The anger drained away, leaving only exhaustion and the raw truth underneath. "I need to not be afraid," she whispered. "I need to know that my choices matter. I need to know that someone is protecting me with me, not for me. There's a difference." She sat down heavily in the chair across from his desk. "And I need to know that the man helping me isn't just another version of the man hurting me." Alessandro came around the desk and sat beside her, not behind it. The symbolic shift was small but profound. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I made assumptions. I made decisions without you. That was wrong." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a vulnerability she hadn't heard before. "I built an empire on knowing everything, controlling everything. I don't know how to help without doing that. But I'm willing to learn." Emma looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the Mafia boss from restaurant rumors but a man genuinely trying to do better. "Then we do this together," she said. "Whatever comes next, we decide together." Upstairs in the penthouse, Lucia had heard their raised voices through the study door. She'd positioned herself there deliberately, her blind eyes turned toward the voices, listening to the argument unfold with the intensity of someone reading between every word. When the voices softened, when the anger transformed into something like understanding, she smiled to herself. Her son was changing, not through violence or vengeance, but through the simple act of being challenged by someone's autonomy. Through learning that protecting someone meant honoring their agency, not erasing it. It was, she thought, the most important lesson he'd ever learned. That same evening, in a modest apartment across town, Matteo Romano prepared USB drives containing the latest batch of evidence against Carl Benson. Financial records going back 5 years. Detailed logs of seized narcotics that didn't match official reports. Names of women who'd filed complaints that mysteriously disappeared from the system. He met with Sarah Chun, the journalist, at a coffee shop in a neighborhood far from either of their usual haunts. "This is going to be big," Sarah said, holding the drive carefully, understanding the weight of what she held. "If this is all verifiable." "It is," Matteo assured her. "Every transaction, every name, cross-reference everything and you'll find a pattern. A cop using his badge as a weapon. A system protecting him because of connections. Corruption from the bottom up." Sarah nodded slowly. "And you can't tell me who gave me this." "Better if you don't know," Matteo replied. The leaks would continue. The pressure would build. The system, once set in motion, would begin eating itself from the inside. The next evening, Emma arrived for her shift at Rossi's to find the dining room in subtle chaos. Servers moving with careful precision. Management whispering into phones. She approached her manager. "What's happening?" "There's someone at table 3 demanding to speak with you," he said grimly. "We've called the police, but—" Emma's blood went cold. She turned toward the dining room and saw him immediately. Carl Benson, still in his uniform, sitting at a corner table with the casual arrogance of a man who believed his badge made him untouchable. His eyes found hers across the restaurant, and he smiled, that predatory smile she knew too well. He raised his hand and beckoned her forward. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. And in the kitchen doorway, Alessandro watched, his phone already in his hand, his expression absolute. The dining room fell silent when Carl Benson stood. Emma was frozen mid-step between the kitchen and his table, caught in the moment before violence crystallizes into action. Benson's face was flushed, his uniform suddenly looking less like armor and more like costume, the thin fabric of authority about to tear. "You think you can just disappear?" he shouted, his voice cracking like a whip across the careful hush of Rossi's. "You think running to this place, playing waitress, pretending you're someone new changes anything? You're mine, Emma. You'll always be." "She's not yours," Alessandro said quietly from the kitchen doorway. He moved into the dining room with the deliberate pace of someone who didn't need to rush. "And you're trespassing." Benson's hand went to his belt, fingers hovering near his service weapon. "Stay out of this, DeLuca. This is a domestic matter." "It's not." Alessandro was beside Emma now, a presence more solid than words. Around them, diners had stopped eating. Phones were already out, cameras recording. "It's assault. It's harassment. It's a man abusing the badge he wears." "You have no idea what you're talking about," Benson hissed, but fear flickered across his features. Quick, unmistakable. He'd miscalculated. He'd come here believing his uniform would protect him, that Alessandro would stand down rather than risk a scene. He'd been wrong. "Get him out," Alessandro said to Marco, who'd emerged from the back with 2 other men. Not threatening, not loud, just inevitable. Benson fought as they escorted him toward the door, shouting about police brutality and false accusations, his voice becoming increasingly desperate as patrons continued recording. The footage would be uploaded within the hour, a cop in uniform out of control, being physically removed from an upscale restaurant by men in dark suits. By morning, it would be everywhere. By noon the next day, the story had metastasized across every news outlet in Chicago. Detective under investigation. Chicago police launch probe into Carl Benson, bribery, assault, and corruption allegations surface. The Tribune's article was devastating in its specificity. Bank transfers, seized narcotics that never made it into evidence lockers, names of women who'd filed complaints that vanished from the system, comparisons to cases where Benson had testified, suggesting perjury, financial connections to the Castellano family's drug distribution network, anonymous sources, impeccable documentation, the kind of exposé that couldn't be dismissed as rumor. Internal Affairs opened an investigation within hours. In his penthouse study, Alessandro watched the story unfold across multiple screens. News broadcasts, social media. The police department's hastily called press conference where administrators scrambled to distance themselves from Benson's alleged actions. He didn't smile. Satisfaction, he'd learned, was a more complex emotion than simple pleasure. It was the recognition that a plan had executed perfectly, that justice, however extrajudicial, however morally complicated, had been served. Matteo entered with a tablet showing updated coverage. It's spreading faster than we anticipated. The unions distancing themselves. His uncle's already lawyered up. And the department is talking about a full audit of cases he's worked. Alessandro nodded, his eyes still on the screens. The system's protecting itself by sacrificing him. He's going to burn, Matteo said simply. That evening, Lucia found her son in the study. She didn't announce herself, simply moved through the space with her familiar grace and sat across from him. When power bends for good, it still remembers the shape of evil, she said quietly. Alessandro turned to face her. What does that mean? It means that in using your power to destroy him, you've changed the shape of your own power. You've bent it, and now it knows it can bend that way. You'll be tempted to bend it again, and again, until the original shape is forgotten entirely. He deserves this, Alessandro said flatly. Perhaps, but deserving and consequences aren't always the same thing. Lucia paused, her blind eyes somehow still finding him across the darkness. I'm not saying you did wrong, Alessandro. I'm saying you've opened a door. Make sure you know what you're walking toward. He leaned back in his chair. Maybe some evils deserve to fear the dark too. Lucia stood slowly. Yes, and maybe those who've learned to live in the dark need to remember what they're fighting for, not what they're fighting against. At her apartment, Emma sat on her sister's couch and watched the news cycle through Benson's face, over and over. The allegations, the investigation, the slow-motion implosion of everything he'd built. She felt relief, genuine, profound relief, for the first time in years. The constant fear that had lived in her chest, the hypervigilance, the way she flinched at sounds that resembled police sirens. All of it was loosening inch by inch. But underneath the relief was something more complicated. Gratitude mixed with discomfort. Recognition that her safety had been purchased. That someone else had made the decision to destroy Carl Benson on her behalf. She thought of what Alessandro had said in his office. We do this together, and wondered if that was really what had happened, or if she'd simply been saved by someone else's power. Once again, the distinction mattered. She knew it mattered. But in this moment, she allowed herself the simple truth. She was safe. Whatever the cost, whatever the complications, she was finally safe. In a holding cell at the 14th precinct, Carl Benson sat on a metal bench, waiting for his lawyer. His uniform had been taken, his badge suspended, his career in freefall. He stared at the concrete wall and made a promise to himself. If I fall, I'm taking everyone with me. His fingers curled into fists. He'd spent years learning how to use leverage, how to manipulate systems, how to weaponize information. He didn't have much left, but he had something. And Alessandro Duca had no idea what was coming. Carl Benson's hands shook as he fed documents into the shredder. Case files, photos, bank statements. Anything that could connect him to the Castellano family. Anything that proved he'd been skimming money from seized narcotics. anything that documented the complicit silence of his superiors. He'd been granted bail pending trial, a small mercy his uncle's connections had managed to secure. 12 hours of freedom to erase the evidence that would seal his fate. He was halfway through the second stack when the door exploded inward. Internal Affairs. Federal agents. A warrant signed by a judge who'd been carefully selected for his willingness to take corruption seriously. They moved through his apartment with the precision of people who knew exactly what they were looking for. Benson lunged for the shredder, but hands grabbed him. Firm, professional, indifferent to his protests. Within minutes, he was against a wall, palms bleeding from the struggle, watching as agents photographed every inch of his life. The shredder was seized. The partially destroyed documents were collected. A safe hidden behind his bedroom mirror was opened, revealing $40,000 in cash and a locked box containing recordings. Recordings of his conversations with his uncle. Recordings of deals made. Recordings of threats issued against women who'd considered pressing charges. Everything he'd tried to destroy was already being documented. At 2:47 a.m., Marco called Alessandro with 3 words, "They have him." Alessandro was already awake, already watching the situation unfold through multiple channels. He acknowledged the call and hung up, then sent a single message to Matteo: "Release the final package." By dawn, the story had evolved beyond tabloid scandal into institutional crisis. The final leak, timed perfectly, delivered anonymously to every major news outlet simultaneously, revealed that Benson's corruption wasn't isolated. It was systemic. His uncle, the deputy chief, had known about the skimming operation for years. Higher-ranking officials had looked away from domestic violence complaints. The entire chain of command had benefited from the implicit protection of someone willing to cross lines they wouldn't cross themselves. The city erupted in outrage. Internal Affairs opened investigations into a dozen officers. The mayor called for a full audit of the department. Federal prosecutors began asking questions that would take months to answer. The police union, sensing disaster, abandoned Benson entirely. He was no longer one of their own. He was a liability, problem to be excised. The morning news cycles were dominated by one story: corruption in Chicago's police department, reaching far higher than anyone had anticipated. The raid on Benson's apartment was captured on news helicopters. A perp walk filmed from multiple angles, showing a man in handcuffs being led from his building to a waiting federal vehicle. His face was defiant, but his hands were shaking. At the precinct, federal agents conducted interviews with officers connected to Benson's unit. Files were seized. Computers were confiscated. The walls were closing in from every direction at once. Alessandro sat in his office and watched the coverage on mute. Matteo stood beside him, holding a tablet showing the real-time updates. Arrests, investigations, the machinery of justice finally moving in a direction that favored someone other than the perpetrator. "It's over," Matteo said quietly. "No," Alessandro replied. "It's just beginning. They'll fight this. His uncle will hire the best lawyers. This will drag on for months. But the outcome is decided. He's finished." That afternoon, in the federal holding facility, Carl Benson sat in an interrogation room across from 2 agents who'd barely introduced themselves before laying out everything they had. The recordings, the cash, the destroyed evidence, the victim statements, the pattern of escalation and intimidation. He realized, with the clarity of absolute defeat, that he was going to prison. Years of it, possibly decades. And as the agents leaned back, waiting for him to crack, Benson felt something shift inside him. A terrible understanding that he'd been outmaneuvered by someone operating on a level he hadn't even known existed. He'd tried to threaten Alessandro that night in the alley. He'd believed his badge made him untouchable. He'd never considered that someone outside the system might understand the system better than he did. Late that evening, Benson was being transferred when he saw Alessandro's car idling across the street from the federal building. Their eyes met for a single moment. Benson in the back of a federal vehicle, handcuffed, facing decades in prison. Alessandro standing outside his car, watching with an expression that was neither victorious nor merciful. Benson pressed his face against the window and screamed, You think you won, DeLuca? His voice was swallowed by the metal and glass and distance between them. Alessandro watched the vehicle pull away, watched Benson's face disappear into the darkness of the federal transport. Then he got back into his car and murmured quietly to the empty silence. I didn't win. She did. The next morning, Emma arrived at Rossi's for her shift to find an envelope placed carefully on the shelf behind the service counter. No name written on it. No postage. Just a white envelope waiting. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a handwritten note. You are safe now. Finish school. No one will ever touch you again. A.D. Beneath it was a check. Enough to change her life. Enough to buy back the years she'd lost to fear. Emma sat down heavily, the envelope in her hands, and began to cry. Not from sadness, but from the strange mixture of gratitude and loss that comes when someone else makes a decision that saves your life. She looked around the restaurant, at the marble and chandeliers and polished surfaces, and understood that her time here was over. Her chapter with Rossi's, with this city, with the person she'd been when she arrived, all of it was closing. Something new was opening. She didn't yet know what it would be, but for the first time in years she would get to choose. The morning light filtered through Rossi's tall windows in pale gold shafts, illuminating dust particles that seemed to float suspended in time. The restaurant was empty except for the cleaning crew finishing their work. The quiet hour before service, when the space belonged to itself. Emma sat alone in a corner booth, the envelope open before her, her hands trembling slightly as she read the note for the third time. You are safe now. Finish school. No one will ever touch you again. A.D. The handwriting was precise, controlled, each letter formed with deliberate care. Not rushed, not emotional, just factual, a statement of reality being declared into existence. She unfolded the check beneath the note and had to read the amount twice to ensure she wasn't misreading the zeros. Enough. More than enough. Enough to finish her degree. Enough to live for a year without working. Enough to start somewhere new. Somewhere that didn't hold memories of fear on every corner. She set the check down carefully, as though it might dissolve if she wasn't gentle enough. The rational part of her mind understood what had happened. She'd seen the news coverage of Benson's arrest, the federal investigation, the institutional corruption being dismantled piece by piece. She understood, in an abstract way, that Alessandro had orchestrated something. Something calculated and comprehensive and designed specifically to ensure that Carl Benson could never hurt her again. But understanding and accepting were different things. She folded the envelope closed and held it against her chest, breathing slowly, trying to process the weight of what it meant to be saved by someone else's power. The relief was profound. A loosening of tension she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it was there. The gratitude was genuine. But underneath both was something more complicated. A recognition that her freedom had been purchased, not earned. That her safety was now a debt. Emma? She looked up to find Lucia standing at the entrance to the dining room, the older woman's silver hair catching the morning light. Lucia moved toward the booth with her familiar grace, her cane tapping softly against the marble. May I sit with you? Lucia asked. Emma nodded, then remembered to speak aloud. Of course, Mrs. DeLuca. Lucia settled into the seat across from her with the careful precision of someone who'd navigated the world without sight for so many years that it had become second nature. Her blind eyes somehow found Emma's face. My son has strange ways of saying he cares, Lucia said gently, noting the envelope in Emma's hands. Emma felt tears gather at the corners of her eyes. He shouldn't have done this for me. Lucia tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something beyond Emma's words. He didn't do it for you, Emma. I don't understand. He did it because of you? Lucia continued, her voice steady and certain. There's a crucial difference. Doing something for someone is about the giver. Doing something because of someone is about what they awaken in you, what they call forth. My son saw your bruises and saw a choice he couldn't ignore. He chose himself, not you. He chose the man he wanted to be, not the man he'd been. Emma sat with this, trying to absorb it. Lucia reached across the table and found Emma's hand with perfect precision. You gave him that gift whether you intended to or not. You forced him to reckon with the kind of power he uses. That's no small thing. The news coverage played on screens throughout the city that week. Detective Carl Benson sentenced to 15 years, federal court convicts former Chicago police officer of corruption, bribery, and assault. The photographs showed Benson being led into the courthouse, his appeal having been denied. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The institutional cooperation was complete. Even his uncle, the deputy chief, faced federal charges. The Tribune published a follow-up investigation, Systemic Corruption, How One Officer's Fall Exposed Departmental Failures. Police Reform Commission launched. Police departments across the city began implementing new protocols. Internal affairs was restructured. A civilian oversight board was established. The machinery of accountability, once set in motion, continued grinding forward with its own momentum. It was justice, Emma thought, but a justice that had required someone outside the system to weaponize the system against itself. She thought about Lucia's words. He didn't do it for you. He did it because of you. 3 weeks after finding the envelope, Emma gave notice at Rossi's. She'd been offered a scholarship to Northwestern, pending final paperwork. She'd found a modest apartment near campus. She'd begun the practical work of building a new life, one chosen by her, for her, even if it had been made possible by Alessandro's intervention. On her last day, she arrived early and stood alone in the dining room where she'd first served Alessandro and Lucia, where a bruise on her cheekbone had caught the light from crystal chandeliers and changed everything. The space felt different now. Not threatening, just a restaurant. Just marble and chandeliers and the ordinary business of serving food to people. The weight it had carried had lifted. She packed her locker carefully, folding her Rossi's uniform for the last time, and walked toward the back exit. That's when she noticed it. A black car idling in the alley. Not menacing, just present. Watching. She knew, without seeing his face, that Alessandro sat behind the wheel. She knew he'd been doing this for weeks. This quiet observation, this distant protection, this refusal to simply disappear now that the crisis had passed. Emma didn't wave. She didn't approach. She simply acknowledged his presence with a small nod, a gesture of acceptance and release. The car remained there for a moment longer, as if in response. Then it pulled away, slowly, deliberately, not fleeing, but allowing her to leave. Emma walked toward the bus stop, her future ahead of her, no longer running from her past but moving towards something entirely new. And in the car that was now disappearing into Chicago's afternoon traffic, Alessandro watched her go, understanding that this, the release, the letting go, the willingness to simply guard from a distance, might be the most important protection he could offer. She was safe, and she was free. Both things finally were true. The apartment was nearly empty by dawn. Emma had packed systematically over the past week. Her clothes folded into a single suitcase, her books stacked in boxes marked with Northwestern's address, her life reduced to what could fit into a car. The place looked larger now, with furniture removed and walls that suddenly seemed too high. Echoing. Anonymous. She'd spent most of the night in this liminal space, unable to sleep, not quite ready to leave. So she sat on the bare floor with her back against the wall and watched the city transform from black to gray to the first hints of gold. Just before dawn, she stood and moved to the window. The black car was still there. It had been there every morning for the past 3 weeks. A constant, quiet presence that somehow didn't feel like surveillance anymore. Felt like guardianship, like promise. She'd stopped flinching at its presence days ago. Emma pressed her palm against the cold glass and looked down at the street below. Even at this hour, Chicago was beginning to stir. Delivery trucks making early runs, a few joggers moving through the pale light, the city waking to another day. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. You don't have to run anymore. Eh? She smiled faintly, reading the message 3 times. Not a command. Not an obligation. Just a statement of fact. Permission, really. Release. The understanding that her moving forward wasn't escape. It was choice. She whispered to the empty room, to the black car below, to the man she'd never properly thanked. Thank you. Then she picked up her suitcase, took one last look at the apartment, at the space where she'd hidden from her fear for so long, and walked toward the door. On the street below, Alessandro read the message confirmation showing it had been delivered. He didn't wait for a response. He'd learned, over the past weeks, that some communications didn't require answers. Some were simply acknowledgement, simply presence. He watched Emma emerge from the building, suitcase in hand, and move toward a waiting taxi. She didn't look toward his car. Didn't need to. Some forms of goodbye didn't require eye contact. He waited until the taxi disappeared into traffic, then pulled away from the curb and turned toward the highway that would take him back to his penthouse. It was time to return to his life, to the business that required his attention, to the empire that never stopped operating, even when its ruler had been momentarily distracted by the simple act of changing someone's fate. Across the city, Lucia De Luca sat in her penthouse study as the sun began its daily ascent. She held a cup of tea in her hands, still warm, and faced toward the window she couldn't see through. Her mind, though, moved across the city like light itself, touching everything, understanding everything, held accountable to nothing. She thought of her son, driving through the early morning, of Emma, moving toward Northwestern and a new beginning, of Carl Benson, somewhere in a federal facility, facing the consequences of his choices. She thought of the shape of power, how it could bend toward cruelty or compassion depending on who held it, how a mafia boss and a terrified waitress had intersected for a moment, and in that intersection, something had shifted in the fundamental architecture of Chicago's darkness. After a long silence, she began to speak, not to anyone present, but to the morning itself, to the city waking below, to the story that was now ending and beginning simultaneously. Some wounds are seen, some are hidden, and some are healed by hands that the world fears most. Her voice was quiet, but it seemed to carry across the skyline, wrapping around the city like a benediction. We tell ourselves that justice requires mercy, that redemption requires innocence. But sometimes justice simply requires someone willing to step outside the system to make it turn on itself. Sometimes healing requires hands that have held weapons. Sometimes the most dangerous men become the most protective, not because they've changed their nature, but because they've finally recognized their power for what it is, not dominion but responsibility. She paused, taking a sip of her tea. Emma Blake will graduate from Northwestern. She'll build a life far from Chicago's shadows. She'll forget, eventually, the taste of fear, but she'll never forget that someone looked at her bruises and decided they were unacceptable. That's not mercy. That's not redemption. That's simply what it looks like when power finally serves something other than itself. The sun rose fully over Lake Michigan, turning the water into molten gold. Chicago woke to a new day. The same city, the same streets, the same architecture of light and shadow. But something had shifted. Some small recalibration of justice. Some tiny adjustment to the balance. In a federal facility, Carl Benson stared at a cell wall and understood that he would spend years here, trapped by his own choices and by the machinery he'd once believed untouchable. At Northwestern, Emma walked through the campus for the first time as an enrolled student. Her bruises completely faded now, visible only in memory. In his penthouse, Alessandro stood at his window and watched the city wake. He felt neither satisfaction nor regret. Only the quiet recognition that sometimes the most important power was the willingness to use power in service of someone else's freedom. And in the city below, the machinery of change continued its slow work. Police reforms implemented. Oversight boards established. Women emboldened to speak about their experiences. The stone wall of institutional protection weakened from within. All of it had started with a bruise on a waitress's cheekbone. All of it had required a man willing to bend his power toward truth. The sun continued its rise. The city continued its waking. And somewhere in that vast, complicated landscape of shadow and light, a story had ended that would reshape everything that came after it. Justice, when it finally arrived, came not with trumpets or proclamations. It came quietly, almost imperceptibly, like dawn itself. arriving not all at once but in gradual increments until the darkness had receded so completely that you couldn't quite remember what it felt like. Chicago had been transformed by hands the world feared. And that transformation, once begun, would ripple outward in ways none of them could yet predict.